Welcome everyone to Disturbing History Mysteries. Today we're embarking on a fascinating journey into the super nasty, insane lives of white plantation mistresses. These are stories that'll leave you both astonished and curious. So grab your time-traveling hats because we're about to step back into the past. Plantation power dynamics. Imagine a big farm where they grow lots of things like cotton and tobacco. On this farm, there were people who were enslaved. They had to work really hard, and their lives were tough. Now, on this farm, there was someone in charge. That's the plantation owner, like the boss of the whole place. But guess what? Sometimes it was a woman who was almost as important as the owner. She had a lot of power, too. She made sure all the enslaved people did their work, and she could be pretty tough. Sometimes she used her power in ways that weren't very nice. She could be mean and make the enslaved people's lives even harder. That's the plantation power dynamics. Who's in charge and how they use their power. It wasn't always fair or kind. Mistresses' dissatisfaction. Now, let's talk about the unhappy mistresses on these plantations. There were women who were married to the bosses of the plantation. They had to act all obedient and nice, but inside they were not happy at all. You see, their husbands, the boss men, would sometimes have other relationships with the enslaved people, especially the black women. Sometimes children from these relationships were born, and they had mixed skin colors. The thing is, these mistresses, the plantation boss's wives, had to follow all the rules and be obedient, but their husbands didn't. This made them really sad and unhappy because they couldn't do anything about it. They felt like they were also enslaved in a way. So, behind their smiles, there was a lot of unhappiness. White mistress and slave intimacy. Let's dive into the part where things get even more complicated. The relationships between white mistresses and black slaves. Now, these relationships were pretty rare, like finding a rare gem. Loneliness and sadness made some white mistresses turn to black slaves for comfort. It was like a secret they couldn't share with the world. But when these relationships happened, it caused a lot of trouble in society. People got mad because they challenged the rules about who could be with whom. You see, mixed-race children were born from these relationships, and that didn't sit well with society's ideas about race. Here's the tough part. Some dark-skinned slaves had to endure abuse in these relationships. Mistresses sometimes did bad things out of boredom or because they were just feeling frustrated in life. Both male and female dark-skinned slaves were involved in these complicated relationships with the white mistresses. It was like a hidden world of secrets and desires. To make things even more confusing, some people tried to make the mistresses' actions seem right by saying that white women were better than black women. They used this idea to justify the mistresses' behavior. So what you should remember is that these relationships happened because the mistresses were often sad, lonely, and trapped in a culture that had strict rules. And sometimes they tried to find happiness in the wrong places. Impact on traditional Christian values. Now let's talk about how these relationships messed with traditional Christian values. You see, back in the day, people had some strict ideas about how they should behave. Mistresses were supposed to be like angels, pure and virtuous. They were expected to be super good and follow the rules. But here's where things get tricky. Some of these mistresses didn't follow those rules. Their actions went against the traditional Christian values. It's like they were wearing a halo on the outside, but on the inside, they were up to some questionable stuff. This whole situation put a lot of strain on the moral values of white women, especially those who were considered high class. It's like they were walking on a tightrope between what they were supposed to be and what they really were. So, in simple terms, these relationships made it hard for some mistresses to be as pure and virtuous as they were supposed to be. It's like they were caught in a moral tug of war. Regulation of white mistress intimacy. In those days, the rules were strict, especially for the white mistresses. They had to follow the law and culture that controlled their actions. One big no-no was adultery, being unfaithful to their husbands. If a white mistress was caught doing that, there would be serious consequences. They'd get into a lot of trouble. And if they had babies outside of marriage, it was seen as super shameful. It's like society had a set of rules, and they had to follow them. White women were expected to be modest and careful, especially when it came to their personal relationships. So, you can think of it like this. The white mistresses had to tiptoe around these strict rules, and any misstep could get them in big trouble. It's like they were living in a world with lots of do's and don'ts. Role of white women in the domestic sphere. Picture a place where white women had a big responsibility. They had to make sure everything ran smoothly at home and that everyone followed traditional Christian values. This was really important to keep peace and order. People saw these women as the embodiment of virtue, meaning they were expected to be super good and pure. They were thought to be not as strong as men, but they were seen as really, really morally upright, which means they were supposed to be extra good. So their role was all about keeping the home in tip-top shape, and that was a big deal in those days. Behavioral control of white women. Even though white women had some freedom, they had certain rules to follow, especially when it came to their relationships with black slaves. Now, the really tricky part was that getting pregnant in these relationships was a big concern. But guess what? There were ways to prevent it, like using things kind of like condoms that were made from different materials. So white women had a bit of freedom, but they still had to be super careful in these relationships. Children of mixed race. Let's talk about what happened to the kids born from these relationships between white women and black men. Imagine a world where some children had both white and black parents. These kids faced different paths in life, and their stories were often pretty tough. Some of them were sold into slavery because, well, their existence could create big problems and scandals. It's like they were hidden away to keep things quiet and avoid causing a stir in society. But for others, their story took an even sadder turn. Some of these children didn't get the chance to live. It's heartbreaking, but they were not allowed to grow up. They faced something called infanticide, which means they were taken away and didn't get the chance to grow up. It's a really sad part of this whole story. Reasons for behavioral relations. You see, life on the plantations could be pretty monotonous. These women, the white mistresses, sometimes felt lonely or just unfulfilled. So in their boredom or frustration, they turned to black men for companionship or, well, some excitement. But here's the twist. Some of these women found themselves in positions where they had more control and power. That's where the power dynamics come into play. Maybe they were more independent because their husbands weren't around, or perhaps they felt a certain level of dominance. It's like they used these relationships to fill a void or even feel a sense of power they might not have in other aspects of their lives. Now, the other interesting thing is that some of these women took steps to prevent getting pregnant. They used methods like abortions or contraceptives to reduce the risks. That way, they could have these relationships while keeping a lid on the potential scandal of mixed-race children. So, in a nutshell, it's a mix of boredom, power dynamics, and some strategic planning to avoid unwanted consequences. Thank you for delving into the super nasty, insane lives of white plantation mistresses. Their lives were far from simple and hidden. If you found this journey through history intriguing, stay tuned for more exciting stories with disturbing history mysteries. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of the past with us.